Are we ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Kuhl, I'm not, this is not under testimony. Do you think that any new gas-fired plants will get built in New England in the next few years? Well, you're an expert.
Are you asking me to speculate whether this energy project will be built in fact?
No.
Oh.
We're talking about anywhere in New England, and I'm asking whether or not, you're an expert witness, and whether or not, in your opinion, you think there will be any new gas-fired plants built in New England in the next few years.
I do know that there was a new gas-fired plant recently commissioned in Connecticut, the CPV Toronto plant. That's the most recent one I'm aware of.
And excluding the ones that are under
Are
construction.
there, it's hard to say.
Have you seen any forecasts of people who provide those kinds of expert opinions that show any new gas-fired plants being built in New England, other than those currently under construction, in the next few years?
I'm trying to think if there are any in the queue right now, and I just don't recall it. But that would be the way I would answer that question. Would be to look at the Isonolan interconnection queue and see what projects are asking Isonolan to perform interconnection studies. But I just, off the top of my head, I can't tell you that.
And no one particular facility jumps out at you either?
Well, I do know that the Bridgeport Harbor plant, which is the last coal-fired plant in Connecticut, will be shutting down next year, and the owner intends to replace it with a gas-fired plant.
You've talked in your testimony about the work you've done with renewables and contracts for renewables. Could you give me a little bit more detail about when you think we might see those renewables entering into our market? For example, when do you think excluding the Little Block Island project, when do you think these offshore wind projects will start entering?
It takes a while to develop offshore wind projects. The supply chain is immature in New England, so it will take some time for those projects not only to continue their development, but to be permitted and constructed. It will take several construction seasons because you can't build 800 megawatts in one construction season. So I don't know for sure, but it won't be in the next 2 or 3 years. It will be farther out than that.
Do you think they'll come on in phases?
Yes.
What about the transmission line and bringing in renewables by the transmission line? When do you think that'll happen?
Are you talking about the Northeast Energy Connect project?
Yes, the hydro.
The Hydro-Quebec project? Again, that's a project that will have to go through the siting and permitting process. That contract has not yet been approved in Massachusetts by the commission there, so it will take some time, and it will be a few years out, not 2 or 3, probably more.
Did you have the opportunity to read the testimony, the recent testimony filed by Mr. Walker on behalf of the town of Barville?
I did. It's not fresh in my mind.
All right. To refresh your recollection, in his latest testimony, he illustrated that there are just under 3,000 megawatts enrolled in the FCA 13 substitution auction. Do you recall that?
Not specifically, no.
Have you looked at the renewable megawatts that are enrolled in the substitution auction for FCA 13?
I have not.
Without getting into specifics about the number of megawatts, do you think that the renewables that are participating in the substitution auction will impact the electric industry in the near term in terms of reduced carbon emissions?
Yes, once they're constructed and developed, particularly if they replace fossil resources that intend to trade off their capacity supply obligations to these renewable resources through that substitution auction process, yes.
I'd like to start talking now about the regional advisory opinion. And this is going to be shifting gears without a clutch here, because these questions are questions on the economic forecasts and projections, as opposed to emissions that were deferred from previous time. So,
Madam Chairperson, sorry. Our witness was for greenhouse gas emissions. OER did have a statutory role in the needs and reliability and cost portion of this proceeding, but Dr. Cool was not OER's witness for that, and then the resulting opinion came from the Public Utilities Commission, and OER would defer to that opinion for any questions related to the cost and need of the project.
well, as I recall what happened, first of all, there is no witness for the PUC because they had a hearing, so they're not going to produce a witness. Second of all, when I was examining the planning witnesses and we got into these issues on economics, I was specifically told to wait until Dr. Cool showed up. And I'm more than happy to do Dr. Cool on these issues on another day. I have no problem with that. I just thought that today was the day. That's why I tried to clarify it at the beginning.
If I may, Chairperson, on behalf of planning, Dr. Cool was never purported to be an economic witness. Dr. Godwin was here on the economic analysis for planning. He appeared last time. The questions that we asked be deferred specifically had to do with Dr. Cool's analysis of Energy 2035, the Rhode Island State Energy Plan. Now, if there's been some confusion and we need to have Dr. Godwin come back on the economic analysis, planning would be happy to do that if the board so wishes, but Dr. Cool's expertise has to do with her analysis of Energy 2035, which is part of the state guide plan that deals with energy planning.
Well, maybe I used the wrong term when I said economics. I tried to combine all of the questions that I was, because I went through each one in detail and I said, is this Dr. Cool or is this you? And they said Dr. Cool, and so I noted it in my notes, Dr. Cool. For example, the estimate of the earnings that each worker would earn in working on the job. Planning pointed out that Invenergy had used an estimate of $179,000 for a job, and they said that the average annual wage for construction workers was only $57,000. That was one of my questions. It was deferred to Dr. Cool. If that's not Dr. Cool, then Cool.
Yeah, I believe those questions were asked and answered by Dr. Godwin. Those questions are not appropriate for Dr. Cool. We've always been very clear that Dr. Cool was the reviewer of Energy 2035, that Dr. Godwin was here on the economic analysis, and that Mr. Nelson was here on the socioeconomic analysis.
I don't know what to say. I tried to ask these questions and I was told to ask them to Dr. Cool. And again, I'm happy to do it on another day.
Who said that?
Well, the two doctors were on the stand, and they said, we weren't hired to do that. And I said, is that Dr. Cool? And they said, yes. So as I went through them, they either answered it or they said Dr. Cool. And I noted it in my notes, which went to Dr. Cool. I mean, it may well be that given the record that's been developed so far, I've got enough information and I could defer or just go without it. Frankly, I wasn't sure we were going to do this today, which is why I asked the clarifying question when we started. And so again, maybe, Dr. Cooley, are you out of state or are you in state?
My office is in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Chairperson, I don't think Dr. Cool would be the person to answer those anyway. I do remember the planning witnesses did get some energy 2035 questions, and they deferred those to Dr. Cool. I'm not sure if they deferred that particular question that Mr. McElroy asked, because that would have fell within Commerce's, planning's, Office of Regulatory Reform.
Dr. Godwin answered several questions about numbers of workers and economic impact of workers while he was here. And he would be the appropriate witness to answer those questions.
Well, I'd like to simplify this if I could. What I'll do is pass on these questions for now, and I'll review them, and I'll review the transcript. And if I feel I need to ask more questions of Dr. Cool, I'll let council know, and we'll see if we can work something out. We have plenty of hearing days left.
Okay. Works for me. Thanks.
All right, so I'm looking at the advisory opinion of the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources that was served on September 12, 2016. Dr. Cooley, are you prepared to answer questions about that?
I'm prepared to answer questions about the energy portion of that advisory opinion.
We'll ask some questions and see if that's within your area, okay?
Okay.
So let's start on page 2. Unfortunately, there are no line numbers on this, so...
Sorry, I need a full copy.
Yes. This is the original.
Dr. Cool, I think he's talking about OERs.
Oh, OERs?
Yeah.
Oh,
Correct.
sorry, I thought we were at the statewide planning.
No, I see. That's where we were, but I've deferred them.
Okay, I'm sorry. So supplemental advisory opinion?
No, the original.
Okay.
Okay. And again, I apologize, there's no page number, so I'll try to direct you as best I can within the page. So I'm at the top of page 2. And this first paragraph summarizes the direction that OER received from EFSB, correct?
That's correct, in
And-
that order.
Right, and the first thing, beginning on the 4th line, is OER was asked by this board to, quote, render an advisory opinion as to, 1, the impacts of the facility on anticipated greenhouse gas emissions that would result from the proposed facility and the cumulative impact over the life of the project, end quote, correct?
Correct.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but so far, I have not seen any analysis over the life of the project. Are you aware that the project could easily be in existence for 40 years?
So the way that I addressed this was to examine the modeling that was performed by Invenergy's consultant, which, you're correct, did modeling out for 4 years, and then I evaluated how the system would change beyond that point, and as I've been explaining in responses to Attorney Elmer's questions, my estimation is that because of the changing mix of resources in New England, that the project would continue to contribute to decreasing emissions compared to a world without the project, but that impact would diminish over time.
Okay, but you don't have, and I'm not criticizing you in any way, but you didn't do an analysis. This is based on your expert opinion where you think trends are going, as opposed to selecting a 40-year life and crunching some numbers. Is that a fair statement?
Correct. We didn't quantify it using our own independent modeling systems. Correct.
That's what I should have said. Thanks.
So you also didn't quantify what you thought would be actual emissions of CO2 over the life of the facility.
Correct. I used the information that was provided by Invenergy, mostly from their air permit and their air permit addendum and the various data responses in order to derive information about the expected emission rate. And so I could use that rate plus what Invenergy was estimating as the annual generation from the plant. And I did come up with a tons per year estimate.
And then is there a number? I just don't know where it is, and I read this carefully too, but that says X equals the tons of CO2 emitted over the projected life, if you can find that.
No, I did not project it over the life. It was on an annual basis because it's hard to forecast 20 years out how much that resource would generate. My expectation is that it would diminish over time, but I did not quantify that. So that would take a fairly complicated dispatch model in order to analyze this.
Also, staying on page 2 in the same direction at the top of the page that we just quoted from this board, OER was asked to render an advisory opinion as to, one, the impacts of the facility on anticipated greenhouse gas emissions. Would you agree with me that it doesn't say the regional impacts, it says the impacts?
It says the impacts. It's not limited in any way.
Did you do any analysis of the Rhode Island only impacts?
Again, using the model results that we conducted our independent due diligence on, evaluated whether the input values were reasonable, whether the fuel price forecasts were reasonable, all the variables that went into that model, and then we looked at the results. Through some further data requests to Invenergy, we asked Invenergy to provide more detail, more granular detail, and use that granular detail to break down the sources of the emissions. There is a confidential attachment to the supplementary advisory opinion that breaks down the emissions based on whether they come from the facility itself, whether it's from the rest of ICE New England excluding Rhode Island excluding the facility, and New York, and then it's summed to a total. The total across the whole footprint, the New England, New York footprint, is negative, meaning that operation of the facility would result in a regional decrease in CO2 emissions. These charts show how that decrease would be apportioned among those different categories of resources. But again, this is in a confidential attachment. I can describe it, but can't share it.
I understand. If you look only at Rhode Island, and the direction is to look at impacts, and I can understand why you would say, let's look at regional impacts, which is what Invenergy and its consultant PA did. But it would seem to me that you should also look at Rhode Island impacts in order to give the board a complete picture of all the impacts, and to give the board the opportunity to choose between generation-based calculations and consumption-based calculations. So without giving any confidential numbers or putting them on the record, which we could do if we closed the room, but I don't think it's needed, can you at least agree with me that if we look at it on a generation-based accounting method, that the emissions impacts to Rhode Island would be a very large, approximately 30% increase?
I can't verify that number 30%. We didn't do it on that basis. Certainly, if you were to put a bubble over Rhode Island, an imaginary bubble, and we're looking at just the the CO2 sources from electric generation within Rhode Island with the plant operational emissions from the facility would increase within Rhode Island. Some other gas-fired plants within Rhode Island would decrease their emissions because they would be displaced. And then other generators outside of Rhode Island would have their operation, their generation also decreased, and New York as well.
Would you, without putting a number on it, agree with me that under that bubble scenario, the generation model, that the increase in CO2 emissions in Rhode Island would be significant?
Again, significant is an arbitrary term. It would increase directionally, yes.
Well, the decrease regionally is less than 1%, correct? 0.89%, I think we established. Certainly the increase in Rhode Island, if we looked at it from a generation basis, would be much more than 0.89%, wouldn't it?
It would. And, part of that is because region-wide, the fleet of generation resources in New England is 32,000 gigawatts or more. If you add a 1,000 megawatt plant, it will be it's a small impact on a very large system.
And would you agree with me that part of this board's statutory charge is to determine whether or not this proposed facility will result in unacceptable environmental harm to Rhode Island?
I know that the board is statutory authority.
Yes.
I don't know off the top of my head the wording, but I would assume it is along those lines.
Okay. Thank you. I'm looking at page 8 on the top paragraph, and what I'd like to discuss with you for a moment is the fast start and flexible generating capacity that will support the integration of new and existing renewable generation onto the power grid. It starts about 4 or 5 lines down. Do you see that?
On page 8?
Yes, page 8. We're about is the end of a quote that carries over from page 7, and then 1, 2, 3 lines down from the top. It says the fast start and flexible generating capability. Am I on the wrong? Are we not on the same document?
Supplemental advisory?
No, the original.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Yes.
So you see that sentence?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that, and I think it's been testified to a number of times, that the intent is for this correct facility to be the most efficient gas-fired facility in the region?
My understanding is that the technology will be a GE H-series gas turbine. To the best of my knowledge, there's only one other H-series combustion turbine in operation in New England, and that would be the Atlantic facility. So yes, it would be state-of-the-art.
And would you agree with me that given the way these facilities are generally dispatched for baseload purposes, it's likely, at least in the initial years of operation, if this facility were to get permitted, that it would be running as a baseload unit pretty much all the time, barring going down for maintenance, etc.
I wouldn't characterize it as baseload.
No. What would you characterize it as?
I'm pausing because I think some of this is based on confidential information.
I don't want you to
exactly
disclose any of
how
that.
it would operate, but it would not be running around the clock. It would have the capability to cycle, particularly in shoulder periods. It might operate during the day and cycle down at night when loads are low.
let's do it this way, again, please don't reveal any confidential information, I'm not asking you to. If the answer would require that, please tell me in advance and don't disclose it, okay? As compared to other gas-fired units in New England, would you anticipate that given the way load is dispatched, that CREC will be one of the first units dispatched?
First, fossil units.
That's what I meant, fossil
Yeah,
fuel,
right.
yes, fossil
So
fuel.
it would be dispatched after nuclear, which would clearly be base load. It would be dispatched after, by after I mean above it in merit order, after solar resources, after wind resources, probably after many or most biomass resources, which tend to run base load. It might be the next one, thereby displacing less efficient fossil resources higher in the merit order.
And so it will probably be a gas-fired facility in New England that will probably be running more often than almost any other facility in New England.
More often than other gas-fired facilities.
I'm sorry if
Yeah.
that's what I meant to say.
Okay, by often, yes, more hours than other gas-fired facilities that are less efficient technologies.
So the point that I've not been making very effectively, I think is summarized on page 14, starting 6 lines up from the bottom in that one sentence. And by the way, did you draft this?
I did.
It says, as one of the most efficient gas-fired generating resources in New England, the project would be expected to operate at a high capacity factor, at times operating at base load, and other times cycling to minimum load as determined by market cycling to minimum load as determined by market conditions. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
And you still feel that way?
Yes. I don't know how frequently it would operate around the clock and how frequently it would cycle either to base load or be cycled off on certain days.
Moving to page 15 at the very top, you state that based on PA's model, when both units are operational, the project is expected to generate approximately 6 million megawatt hours per year, or a capacity factor of approximately 70%, correct?
Yes, very round numbers.
So, capacity factor, is it oversimplification to say that the unit would be running about 70% of the time?
Well, 70% capacity factor doesn't mean 70% of the hours, but it means that if you take the ratio of the number of megawatt hours that it operates in a year and divide it by the number of megawatt hours that it would operate in a year if it was running at 100% in all hours, that would give you that ratio. So it's not number of hours, but it's the ratio of megawatt hours actually running to the total number of megawatt hours it could possibly run in it.
Okay, good, thank you. And on page 16, this again summarizes what we've already been testifying to, right just below the middle, about 8 lines up from the bottom. It says Clear River's natural gas units have an estimated net plant heat rate of 6,254 BTU per kilowatt hour, which would make it one of the most efficient combined cycle plants in the region, correct?
Correct.
And then its low heat rate, which basically, if I'm oversimplifying, let me know, means that it can make kilowatt hours with a smaller amount of gas than most plants. So its heat rate, it's able to do it more efficiently.
Correct. The lower heat rate means more efficient.
Its low heat rate combined with the competitive cost of natural gas over the forecast period make it reasonable to expect that CREC will be dispatched early in merit order and therefore displace less efficient dispatchable generating resources with higher unit costs of production, primarily resources that burn coal or oil as a fuel source, as well as less efficient gas-fired resources. Correct?
Correct. And then it continues on to say all of which have a higher CO2 emission rate on a pounds per megawatt hour basis.
Right. On page 22, please. At the top, you're talking about PA's model again. And in the second sentence, it says, relative to a reference case without the project, CO2 emissions decrease in each ISO, NE, and NY ISO zone, except within Rhode Island, where CO2 emissions increase when the project is operating, correct?
Correct.
And at the bottom of that paragraph, it repeats the point. Importantly, the figure illustrates that while operation of CREC increases the CO2 emissions within Rhode Island, the other fossil fuel plants within Rhode Island are expected to decrease net emissions over the forecast period due to the operation of CREC, correct?
Correct.
Now on page 29, at the top, second line down from the bottom, the advisory opinion expresses the opinion that construction of the project would not prevent the state from achieving the Resilient Rhode Island Act GHG reduction targets, as long as the state maintains its dedicated commitment to aggressive energy efficiency and other clean energy policies, correct?
I'm not seeing the sentence. Page 29.
Yes, it's the second line down from the top of the page. It starts, construction of the project would not prevent.
It's the middle of a sentence, so if you look at page 29, one word in on the second line, construction of the project, but it's the middle of the sentence.
This is the original advisory opinion, OER.
It's on the screen.
Oh, the second paragraph. I was looking at that. Sure.
So the opinion is being expressed to this board that construction of the project would not prevent the state from achieving Resilient Rhode Island Act greenhouse gas reduction targets, correct?
Correct.
And as I think has been made clear both here and in other documents, that's only true if you adopt a consumption-based accounting method, correct?
No. Under the Resilient Rhode Island Act, the Act, first of all, establishes the EC4, and then the EC4 is charged with developing metrics by which progress toward achieving the Resilient Rhode Island Act's progress would be measured. And in May of 2016, the EC4 determined that the metric would be, in fact, on a consumption basis, so that has become the metric.
Well, I understand that. You're not arguing, though, that this board is bound by the determination of the EC4, making its unacceptable harm to the environment determination, are you?
I was asked to evaluate whether the plans would be consistent with the state energy policy, which includes, the greenhouse gas plan that was developed by EC4. So that's the gauge that I was evaluating. But I provided information to look at it in different ways.
I understand. So, but what I'm saying is that the opinion expressed here that construction would not prevent the state from achieving the Resilient Rhode Island Act greenhouse gas reduction targets is dependent on the adoption of the consumption method of accounting as opposed to the generation method of accounting, isn't it?
I don't think I'm saying that. Again, it depends on what programs and measures are implemented, whether that's, for example, reducing or promoting energy efficiency would also reduce load in the state, which would reduce emissions regardless of how you measure it. So I couldn't say that one accounting method or the other would give you different, would give you, or would virtually achieve that the target wouldn't be met.
But would you agree with me that if you used the generation method as opposed to the consumption method, it would be more difficult to meet the targets?
Well, again, it's economy-wide, so, and the energy sector is relatively small, of the three sectors, the relatively smallest, so there are a lot of things in play.
So your answer is you don't know?
No, I don't know.
Okay, that's fair. All right, now I'd like to move to the supplemental advisory opinion of OER. Let me know when you have it. Do you have it?
I do.
Okay, page 4, please. The first full paragraph, the last 4 lines. And what the opinion is doing here is summarizing what you said. It said that you observed that the updated model forecasted that regional CO2 emissions decreased by approximately 10% on an average annual basis in the updated 2017 model relative to the model prepared for the application, regardless of whether or not the project was assumed to be operating, correct?
Correct. So the way the model was run is that PA developed a reference case, which is a world without the project, and then in parallel a case with the project, and compared the emissions and other parameters between the two cases. And in both cases, regional CO2 emissions dropped by about 10%.
So in both cases, whether it's with the project or without the project, you had a 10% reduction.
Yes, but a little bit more, obviously, with the project.
Page 6, please. Heading B, materials reviewed and redacted information.
Yes.
You've listed the materials that were reviewed and relied upon, and there were two things that you specifically listed were Mr. Hardy's testimony and data from ISO, correct?
Correct.
Did you read and review, for example, the testimony of Dr. Roberts?
I'm trying to think of the time I have, yes. I'm just trying to recall whether the timing would have been before this was issued or after, but I have, yes, I have.
You didn't list it as a document that was reviewed or relied upon?
So what I'm listing here are sources of data that were used to form the opinion. It doesn't mean that I did not, it's not a comprehensive list of everything that I read, but it's the data sources that I used to do my independent analysis.
The data sources you used were from Invenergy, and the ISO. I understand the ISO, no problem. But Invenergy is a party in this case.
Yes.
Did you look to any of the other parties for any of the data they provided? For example, again, Dr. Roberts, for Boroughville, Mr. Walker. Did you look at the data he provided?
Well, I needed data on the plant itself, the facility, things like the emission rates, the heat rates, the footprint of the facility, and that information had to come from Invenergy.
Okay. Page 8, please. The bullet at the bottom of the page, please.
Yes.
You're talking about PA's updated reference case model there. And the bullet says the updated model did not, however, include the prospective development of up to 1,600 megawatts of OSW, which is offshore wind, correct? And up to 9.45, is it terawatt hours? Am I doing that correctly?
Yes.
TWH?
Yes.
Of other clean energy resources to be procured under sections 83C and 83D of the Massachusetts Energy Diversity Act, respectively. Since the procurement was nascent at the time, and none of these new resources were under contract, it was not unreasonable to omit them from the analysis. What is the current status of these new resources?
Well, let me first preface this by saying this bullet is referring to PA's model that was prepared and distributed in May 2017, and it was subsequently updated. But in May 2017, those particular procurements hadn't yet been, fully conducted, and so there was no reason to, at that point, have information about including them. Subsequently, we asked Invenergy to update their analysis to include those procurements.
And have they done that?
Yes.
Okay. So these are no longer nascent, but as you explained earlier in your testimony, they've moved a good ways down the road.
Well, under Massachusetts 83D, there was a contract with Hydro-Quebec and the developer of the transmission line. That contract is before the Massachusetts DPU and has not yet been approved. And 800 megawatts of a project, of an offshore wind project with Vineyard Wind also has been submitted to the Massachusetts DPU. Has not yet been approved. The proceeding has barely begun.
On page 17, please. Right in the middle of the page. The bolded heading begins despite, if I can read the last sentence. It says, however, if CREC does not achieve COD, which is commercial operation date, by 2020, it will not contribute to meeting Rhode Island's interim 2020 goal. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you're aware that they are now projecting commercial operation of 2021 for Unit 1.
That's my understanding, so there's no way it would have any impact on 2020 missions.
That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Just a couple of questions. Good afternoon, Dr. Gould. Dr. Gould, the document that's the 2016 ISO New England Electric Generator Air Emissions Report, I believe you have it before you there. The January 2018 report, CLS 15.
It's dated January 2018, but it contains the results of the it contains the data for the 2016 calendar year.
Understood. There were some questions on page 22, if you could direct your attention to that. There were questions with regard, I believe it was Mr. McElroy asked you some questions. Maybe it was Mr. Elmer, but I remember Mr. McElroy as well. Table 5-2 on the top.
Yes, sir.
And you were pointed to the CO2 data and the notation about the emissions rate percent changes at 5% reduction, I believe, for 2015 and 2016 on the chart. You see that?
Yes.
And I believe Mr. McElroy's question was, is that asking you to confirm that that reduction occurs without any contribution from the Energy project? Correct?
Correct.
Okay. Look at the next sentence below that. And if you could just read that sentence that appears there.
Sure. It says, overall, total system emissions have declined over the last 10 years, which can be attributed to several factors.
Okay. So this is a paragraph that refers to some reasons why there have been total system emissions declines over the last 10 years. And there are several bullets that the authors want the reader to look at. What's the first bullet?
The first bullet says, increased use of highly efficient natural gas-fired generators.
So do you understand that the authors believe that one of the reasons total system emissions have declined over the last 10 years is due to the increased use of highly efficient natural gas-fired generators?
Yes, that's ISO New England's conclusion.
Thank you. And am I correct that I have heard your testimony referenced earlier by Mr. McElroy that the Invenergy project, if constructed, would be one of the most efficient combined cycle generators in the region?
Yes.
Okay. And would it also be true then that if the project is constructed as one of the most efficient combined cycle generation resources in the region, that you could expect that that rate, the emissions rate, would be reduced more than it would be without the introduction of that project into this region?
Directionally, I agree with you that operation of a highly efficient state-of-the-art combined cycle plant by virtue of displacing emissions from less efficient generators, because that's the way ISO's system works. It would directionally continue to lower the emission rate.
And is it also true that the more efficient natural gas-fired generator utilized will translate into a greater annual system emissions reduction than without that more efficient generator?
Directionally, yes.
Thank you. That's all I have.
I have a few more, if I may, based on matters that you raised in Mr. McElroy and Mr. Shore's calls.
I was going to ask Mr. McCutcheon if he had any redirect.
I'm sorry. I don't want to jump my place in the queue.
I do, a couple questions. If you could turn to page 1 of the advisory opinion of the Office of Energy Resources.
Yes.
In section 1, entitled Introduction, it's that first paragraph, it's probably halfway through. It says, beginning with on November 16th.
Yes.
It says, on November 16th, 2016, the above referenced docket SB-2015-06 was open for purpose of considering Invenergy's application. Is there a correction there that you would like to make?
Yes, I would. There is a typographical error in the sentence that you read on November 16th, 2016. It should read on November 16th, 2015.
Okay, thank you. And this is a board exhibit, so if the board would be okay, we'd like to correct that mistake in the opinion.
That's fine.
Could you turn to page 1 of the supplemental advisory opinion of the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources?
Yes, I'm there.
In section 1, introduction, same sentence in this opinion. Is there a correction to be made?
There is a similar correction in the middle of that paragraph. It says on November 16th, 2016, and that should read on November 16th, 2015.
Thank you. Same thing, this is a board exhibit. It's okay with the board, we'd like to update the typo. Dr. Kuhl, you got several questions regarding the suggesting that renewable energy investments would continue based on aggressive state policies. If you turn to the advisory opinion, the original advisory opinion, page 34. Section 4B.
What page, please?
34. And this is the original OER advisory opinion. Section 4B, it's the second sentence. It says, state energy policies that promote investment in diversified, no to low carbon, clean energy resources, including renewables and energy efficiency, will not be adversely impacted by the project. Do you agree with that today?
I do.
Okay, thank you. So that's all.
Dr. Kuhl, in response to a question by Mr. McElroy about new gas-fired plants, you mentioned the footprint facility in Salem Harbor, Massachusetts. Is that right?
I did.
And
Didn't she mention Tewantic?
she did as well, yes. I'm going to ask about footprint. You're aware of the fact that after the Energy Facility Siting Board in Massachusetts granted a building permit, construction permit to Footprint, there was a lawsuit challenging the permit on the basis of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Are you aware of that?
I'm fully aware of the lawsuit. Exactly what statute was brought under, I could not report to you.
And you're aware of the fact that the result of that lawsuit was that a permit was issued, but with an annually declining cap on the carbon emissions from that power plant.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And when Mr. McElroy asked you about the effect on Rhode Island carbon emissions of this plant, if you assumed a production-based method of accounting, this was the question, the imaginary bubble question, where your answer was, if you could place an imaginary bubble over Rhode Island and only count in-state emissions, then emissions would go up in Rhode Island. Do you recall that?
Yes.
In fact, that's exactly what Massachusetts has chosen to do and has done in implementing the Global Warming Solutions Act. Isn't that right? They've essentially put an imaginary bubble over the state, and they count the production-based emissions from power plants in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as if there were, in your hypothetical, an imaginary bubble. Is that correct?
I don't agree with what you're saying. There are several sets of regulations that came out of the Kane decision, if you want to open up that topic. So that court decision ruled narrowly on one particular section of the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act. That's specifically an interpretation of Section 3D.
3D.
Right. And as a matter of fact, I can read you 3D. It says the department, meaning the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, shall promulgate regulations establishing a desired level of declining annual aggregate emission limits for sources or categories of sources that emit greenhouse gas emissions. So that decision required the DEP to issue one specific regulation that did limit emissions from fossil generators within the state. But now the DEP was between a rock and a hard place, because under Section 3C of the same Global Warming Solutions Act, the statute says that emission levels and limits associated with the electric sector shall be established by the Executive Office and the Department in consultation with the Department of Energy Resources based on consumption and purchases of electricity from the regional electric grid, taking into account the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And then further, Section 2A5 requires the Commonwealth's greenhouse gas inventory to track emissions based on consumption. And I can read this. So now the DEP, under this decision, had not only were they required to impose regulations that capped emissions in the state, but they had to come up with a consumption-based method of accounting, and were required to, using a consumption-based method of accounting, the court's decision said that the GWSA goals are not goals, but are targets that must be achieved. So, as I said, the DEP was between a rock and a hard place. So they went ahead, the DEP then issued the Clean Energy Standard, which is on a consumption basis. It's even more aggressive than the Renewable Portfolio Standard and adds another few percent of zero carbon energy that must be procured to serve the customers within Massachusetts. So that's a long answer to a simple question.
No, you've answered my question, and I thank you. Now, I'm going to refer you back to what Mr. Shore directed you to, this electric generator air emissions report. report, which is CLF 15. And I'd like you also to look, you have in your right hand now, CLF 17, the New England Power Grid profile. Yes. So let's look at the chart that Mr. Shore directed you to in the ISO air emissions report, page 22, table 5.2. And let's, exactly as you've done, hold that up next to the CLF 17. So Mr. Shore directed you to that first bullet of text, and you said overall total emissions have declined over the past 10 years, which can be attributed to several factors. And Mr. Shore asked you to read the first bullet point: increased use of highly efficient natural gas-fired generators. But Mr. Shore omitted the last bullet point. Could you read that for us?
There are 4 bullet points.
And I'm asking for the 4th.
The 4th one says retirement of oil and coal-fired generation and retrofit of NOx and SO2 emission controls on some of the remaining oil and coal-fired generators.
Now let's look at the CLF 17 New England Power Grid. In 2000, coal and oil together accounted for 40% of the electricity generated in New England. Is that correct?
You're adding 18% and 22% to get 40%, correct?
And in 2017, coal and oil combined amounted to 3%. Is that right?
Yes.
Combined. And during that same period, gas accounted went from 15% in 2000 to 48% in 2017. Is that right?
Yes.
And that really is what the ISO is describing in the air emissions report. The change over the last 10 to 15 years in which gas has replaced coal and oil. Is that right?
Well, there are 2 separate bullets. One is that there are more efficient natural gas-fired generators, some of which may be replacing less efficient natural gas-fired generators, and in addition, oil and coal have retired.
So let's look at the power grid profile, CLF 17. In 2000, nuclear accounted for 31% of the electricity generation in New England. Is that right?
Yes.
And what was it in 2017?
Also 31%.
And hydro went from 7% in 2000 to what in 2017?
8%.
And gas went from what in 2000 to 2017?
From 15% to 48%.
And coal and oil together went from 40% in 2000 to 3% in 2017. Is that correct?
Yes.
If new gas-fired power plants are built in New England, there isn't much coal and oil left to back off the system, is there?
Well, coal and oil will continue to diminish, as well as less efficient natural gas-fired generation.
There's 3% of coal and oil on the system together today?
In 2017, yes.
So there isn't very much coal and oil left to back off the system, is there?
No, I'm wondering if part of the reason why there's not much coal and oil is the relative price of coal and oil relative to natural gas. I believe that this chart, that's what we're trying to figure out, is generation and not capacity.
Yes, this chart is generation and not capacity. there was a point at which Mr. McElroy asked you not to go into confidential information, and I believe you didn't, and I will repeat that request. I'm not asking for confidential information. We're not going to clear the room. But I believe I heard you say, without revealing any confidential information, that you did not believe that this proposed Invenergy plan was always going to operate as a base load facility. Did I hear that correctly?
Correct.
And finally, I believe you may have made a slight mistake that I just want to clear up. In response to a question from Mr. McElroy about CASPR, that is competitive auctions with state policy resources, he was asking what effect that might have on carbon emissions. And you said that you expected that CASPR would have an effect on carbon emissions, especially if the new renewable resources coming in on that second auction were, your words were, trading off with fossil generators, but I would say backing off fossil generators. Is that correct?
I mean, trading off their capacity supply obligation.
Right. But isn't that a requirement of CASPR? CASPR will have an effect on carbon emissions if new renewables come in, because then by definition under the tariff, they're trading megawatt for megawatt with old fossil fuel generators that are retiring.
The presumption is that at-risk generators will be willing to trade off their capacity supply obligation, which tend to be most of these old coal and oil resources.
The presumption is that these will be at-risk resources, but that's not a requirement in the tariff.
No, any resource can elect to
Any
participate.
fossil resource can elect to leave.
I'm not sure that the tariff is restricted to fossil resources.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Any other questions for this one?
Not from here, not from Invenergy.
None from OER.
Good.
I just wanted to clear up one thing about the new other high-tech efficient natural gas plants. At the outset of this proceeding, going back to when the application was filed, Invenergy claimed that they would have the most efficient new gas plant in the region. We've had reference today to two of the most recently qualified, highly efficient gas plants, Tewantic and Salem Harbor. And I believe that Invenergy would be correct in saying that if their plant were built, it would be among the most efficient, because I believe that they're all powered by the same GE turbine engine.
I did look this up recently. The Tewantic plant is a GE 7H series, which is the state-of-the-art. But based on public information I was able to find, the Salem Harbor plant is an F series, a GE 7F series, which is an older generation.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to ask the same question I asked Mr. Hardy, but maybe a little bit differently. It's really about more the out years, because we have a model, we have a process that for a variety of reasons has been delayed, and we have a 4-year model. And I understand what you said about how it's difficult in the out years to look at emissions. I was looking at 2 different statements you made, and I just wanted you to comment on how they combine. So one was in the first advisory opinion where you say, basically, and you've said it over and over, that increasing the penetration of renewable resources and renewable energy generation in the model would diminish but not eliminate the claimed CO2 emission benefits of the project. That's page 12. And then in the supplemental, you say, if one or both crack units are delayed, emission reductions are similarly delayed. That's page 11. So I'm kind of multiplying those two statements and thinking about what we were discussing about offshore wind, and wondering, you had said it was in your supplemental about a 0.4% to a 1.9% of total emissions per year reduction across the region. So is the conclusion to be drawn that if the plant is delayed, or there's one unit and the penetration of renewables increases, it follows logically that the reductions across the region will be diminished?
I think it's fair to say that as the system becomes decarbonized and cleaner, that the impact of Invenergy's plant will be less and less, but directionally it will continue to displace whatever's on the margin, which for the foreseeable future will probably be some kind of fossil resource.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Coles. All right. And given the time, I think, unfortunately, we should not continue with the new witness at this time. And we will reconvene on Thursday.